It is vital that the seed industry continues to innovate to produce new and better cover crop varieties to meet that demand. Future long-term success will require growers, seed companies, and local, state, and federal governments to work in close coordination with one another to develop policies that provide certainty and transparency for these programs to be successful. It's important that we all work together to understand overall demand to ensure that cover crop seed producers are providing the seeds that growers are seeking. Flexibility in USDA, NRCS, and state program seeding requirements and varieties will help seed dealers meet that local demand. Also, understanding cover crop program acreage goals over the short and long term will help the industry plan ahead and make sure that we've got the seed available. This includes NRCS's program demand, including IRA funding, the new Climate Smart Commodities grants, and those state-based programs. We encourage farmers to work with their local seed dealers as far in advance as possible and always buy quality seed from a professional seed dealer. Professionally produced and processed seed has been selected, harvested, cleaned, analyzed, and packaged for performance, and it's best tested for purity, and it's also been tested for purity and germination. All of this helps ensure farmers get the best quality seed to meet their production and sustainability goals while minimizing the presence of invasive and other weeds. As a tool, the American Seed Trade Association has a new resource to help farmers and landowners locate professional cover crop and conservation seed suppliers in their local area. You can find that map searchable by region and seed type at www.betterseed.org under resources. Here's a picture of the map here. If you have any questions about cover crop seed, we encourage you to reach out to ASTA or your local seed dealer or seed company. And with that, I want to hand it over to Ryan at CTIC. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you, Andy, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking time to join us to hear the results of our survey. My name is Ryan Heiniger. I am the Executive Director of the Conservation Technology Information Center. We're a 41-year-old nonprofit member-based organization dedicated to helping bring new technologies and information out to the agriculture and conservation community and, of course, to farmers themselves. Our offices are located in West Lafayette, Indiana, and I actually work remotely from our family farm here in Southeast Iowa. And I would just want to take a minute to echo Andy's comments about the survey not being possible without a partnership involving the American Seed Trade Association, the Sustainable Ag and Research Education Program, and Dr. Myers and his wonderful team at the University of Missouri. So thank you so much. And of course, to the farmers that took time out of their schedules between March 1 and April 2nd this past spring as they were gearing up for planting, or perhaps in the southern U.S. already out in the field to give us their valuable insights that we're excited to be able to share today. So in total, we were fortunate to receive 795 individual farmer responses from all across the country, of which 80% fell into the category of cover crop users, some 8% as farmers who had previously used cover crops, but as of the survey were no longer, and then 11% came from the non-cover crop user category for the purpose of expressing this data going forward. Just for full information, the previous users and the non-users are categorized together. Next slide, please. I could not be more excited to have such great geographic distribution of our responses, again, of those 795 farmers, as far away as 2 in Alaska, 5 in Hawaii. As you can tell here from the map, clearly the Corn Belt is well represented, but again, great distribution throughout the entire country. And of course, that also is reflected in the crop types that those farmers grow on their own operations, which we'll talk more about as well. And before we do that, just again, to show a little bit deeper demographic information about those that did, again, take the time to share their insights. The average age for all respondents was 59, which more or less very closely mirrors the USDA-NIFA data of the average age of a U.S. farmer as well. But again, great distribution throughout the age ranges from 20 to 24, all the way through one farmer in the 85 to 89 year range that took the time to share their insights too. For, again, kind of level setting, providing additional detail about the size of operations. A couple things to take away from here. As you can tell, clearly a great distribution as well, roughly 60% falling into the 499 acres and less category, some 17% in the 1 to 9, which you'll see really does allow that horticultural farm, probably some urban farms as well to be represented, and approximately 40% falling into the 500 acres to 2,000 plus category. So clearly representing large and larger farm operations that are using cover crops and those who do not. We did ask the farmers to self-identify which are the crops that they most closely align with. A couple things to take away from here, which we'll talk more about too. One of the new items this year is diving deeper into livestock grazing and utilizing that forage base that cover crops do represent. So some 16% of those who responded identify as both commodity and livestock producers, along with 8% as solely livestock producers, and clearly, again, nearly 50% in the commodity only category. This is where things start to get intriguing, looking a little bit closer at some of the insights provided by this data set. So I want to call your attention to a couple of things, but as you can clearly tell, a lot of similarities between those who use cover crops and those who are not using cover crops. And so one insight really that this starts to allow us to think about and to reach some conclusions about is that long-held myth that land ownership is perhaps a barrier or detriment to adopting cover crops. And I certainly won't suggest that that's not an issue that a lot of farmers do have to mitigate and overcome in their successful journey. However, looking at 14.2% of cover crop users do not own any of the land that they farm, compared to only 9.6% of non-cover crop users not owning any of the land they farm. And at the complete opposite end of the spectrum, as you can tell at the bottom chart there, only a 1% difference between cover crop users and non-cover crop users that own 100% of their operations. Next slide. This is really a pretty fascinating and very encouraging data set to me personally when thinking about, again, those who do use cover crops and just the sheer amount of experience that they have. So one of the takeaways is that 97% have 2 years or more of experience, but some 40% now in our 7th survey have 10 years or longer of experience. So virtually those farmers have a PhD plus of on the ground real world experience, lessons learned. And I think one of the aspects, the story within the story, if you will, here is that from a mentoring standpoint, sharing of lessons learned and insights with folks with less experience or that still have yet to trial and error cover crops on their operations. What a great number of ambassadors, champions, farmer peer leaders to be able to pull from and draw from across the country. Next slide. So again, the data offers us some really fabulous insights into some similarities as well as some potential differences in how cover crop users and non-cover crop users view their operations and manage their farms, one of which is how they use tillage. And as you could tell here, there's a pretty stark difference between almost over a 2-to-1 difference of farmers that do use cover crops and adopt a continuous no-till, meaning they do not use tillage among any of their crops, or that's how they report, at 58% to 24% of non-cover crop users. And then again, with conventional tillage, almost 5 or 4 times more likely to use conventional tillage in non-users compared to cover crop users. So this certainly also reveals that, cover crops really can be a gateway to helping reduce tillage, ultimately helping preserve that valuable topsoil, help employ some of the latest technologies and conservation practices to steward their soil and water, add to their soil organic matter, among many other benefits that we'll talk about too. So one of the takeaways here is that 251 of those farmers reported that using cover crops significantly decreased the tillage on their operation, and some 119 farmers said that it slightly decreased the tillage that they were using as compared to before applying that practice. Next slide, please. Now, this particular data point perhaps is a little bit counterintuitive in that when you think about transitioning from perhaps a conventional operation to no-till, maybe no-till and cover crops, each one of those steps represents new equipment, new technologies, and just new fertility programs, among many other things that a farmer would have to research and become proficient in to be successful. And so when thinking about adding cover crops on top of the transition to no-till, essentially that is one more moving piece, one more consideration in the overall planning and execution, but yet overwhelmingly 154 farmers felt that adopting cover crops actually made that transition easier. So again, fascinating insights from the farmers themselves. Next slide, please. This may come as no surprise that one of the takeaways here is that soil structure, less soil erosion, less soil compaction, among the many benefits that farmers are seeing and rating as some of the top benefits that they've observed in using cover crops. But what I don't want to have happen here is that folks gloss over or look past the better weed control, because I think this is also, again, a story within a story that starts to emerge throughout the survey, and some of which we won't have time today to go into detail, but that better weed control, perhaps even relating to potential cost savings in their herbicide programs as well, starts to emerge as one of the many benefits of cover crops. So this represents what the 5-year look back history is for those who answered and using cover crops. And clearly, we are excited about the direction of this trend line, going from 325 acres back in 2018 to a reported 413 acres. A couple things to also point out is that compared to the last time we did the survey in 2019-2020, the acres reported was actually at about 465 that would have been reported planted in 2019. However, one possible explanation for this lowered amount is that we did have more horticulture farmers, and of course the size of those operations probably comes into play in bringing the overall acreage down. But nonetheless, we are very excited to see this continued upward growth in total acres applied. And again, just I think further underscoring the goals, the benefits that folks are seeing, that clearly soil health and improving that on their operations is the clear winner, and the very closely related categories of soil organic matter, soil sequestration, for improving the carbon, improving water infiltration, keeping that soil on the farm, reducing soil erosion, all among kind of that top 4 or 5 benefits. On the flip side, one thing to point out, I know Dr. Myers will talk more about this too, is that very few are identifying that receiving an incentive payment is the primary goal. However, we certainly know from other surveys that those incentives, especially for new cover crop users, does play a critical role in their adoption and decision. So just a couple last things, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Myers to go into more detail. But again, new this year, some more detailed questions on cover crop grazing, along with cover crops following corn. And so to just kind of start things off here, this really represents to me a lot of untapped potential in that more than 3/4 of the farmers currently are not utilizing or integrating livestock into their farm fields. Of course, that could be for any number of reasons. The infrastructure, physical fences, even hot wire fences may not be available. The water certainly would be another factor. And of course, just fewer farms perhaps having livestock for a lot of the Corn Belt might be another possible explanation. But I guess my interpretation of this is great potential for very creative opportunities for neighbors that do have livestock, and this starts to come out in some of the data as well. So 17% of the farmers do report utilizing that cover crop for additional forage in their operations. So this is, I think, more fascinating information and insight in that clearly a vast majority, some 77% of the farmers who do graze their cover crops own the livestock directly. However, again, this starts to showcase that perhaps there are some creative solutions. I know some states have livestock grazing co-ops, finding farmers that are looking for other ranchers, other farmers that do have livestock and would be willing to transport them seasonally. And so that 15.4% does reveal that, again, some farmers are seeing the value of having that cover crop grazed, all the fertility that comes with having animals reintegrated into the operations. So timing of cover crop grazing, clearly the front runner here is utilizing the cover crop forage both fall and spring, with slightly fewer farmers utilizing spring only than fall only. One possible scenario would be, of course, after snow melt, runoff, concerns about compaction, among other possible issues with spring only type of grazing. I know Rob is also going to focus more on some of the aspects with seed mixes, so I won't steal his thunder, but just a couple of really valuable insights that clearly farmers who are grazing their cover crops are starting to see the value from a nutritional standpoint, other soil health benefits of continuing to build up that seed mix into 2, 3, 4+ different species. And that holds true for both winter mixes, which of course would be like a cereal rye, a winter wheat, among other species that would overwinter, as well as summer mixes that perhaps are following wheat harvest as one possible scenario there. So folks are seeing the benefits of including more species in their cover crop grazing mixtures. And of course, we all think about and want to know ultimately what the both near-term and long-term, return on investment and profitability components are for cover crops themselves. And I would say this is absolutely consistent with a lot of recent published literature in that, some 40+% are reporting a gain of $25 up to $74 per acre. So well more than enough net profit to offset the cost of getting the cover crop established and all the different considerations. And so this is, again, more great insights from the farmers themselves. So they're seeing annual net profit opportunities as a result of getting the animals back out on the land. And real quickly, just to touch on managing corn after cover crops, I know from personal experience, talking to other farmers, this can be an area where perhaps they can get tripped up on with respect to possible, yield drag and other impacts. And so these farmers that are willing to share their insights is really invaluable information. Next slide. So we wanted to ask the question about termination. And so when looking at planting green, which of course would consist of planting the corn crop right into standing cover crop, maybe that's been sprayed and terminated just a day or two before, compared to 1 week to 2 weeks plus. When you add up those three left columns, clearly more farmers are taking that recommendation that I think a lot of universities have, as well as from other experts, to terminate their corn in advance. But I think one insight to me is that those who are choosing to plant green probably reflects back to that 10 plus years of experience from so many of our respondents from this year's survey. And then finally, just thinking about that nitrogen management program also being a critical thought process and a decision to make sure that they're minimizing any potential hit to that early corn planting stand. So 44% are taking steps to apply extra nitrogen at the time of planting. I would also interpret that 17.7% that are choosing not to include winter cereals as kind of more of the proactive thought process and avoiding some issues with their carbon nitrogen ratios. And so while 38% are not applying extra nitrogen, the majority are taking that into consideration. And final slide is that we don't see any real clear front runner among the types of strategies or methods upon which nitrogen can be applied, whether that's broadcast, whether that's banded dry fertilizer over or near the row, or 2x2 fertilizer placement that often is liquid in origin. So farmers are basically using a number of different opportunities, of course, that would probably coincide with the equipment that they have or is available in their area. So again, thank you all for your time today, and turn it over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Ryan, for all those great insights that you shared, and just kind of picking up on some other things we learned from the survey. Weed control is always a topic of interest, and we saw similar information with both corn and soybeans. Just going to show you the corn slide here for sake of time. But we found that 73% of the farmers did feel that the weed control was better after the cover crops, and only 2% thought it was worse. And then there was a fair chunk at a quarter that thought it was about the same. Of course, that could depend on the species of cover crops they're using, timing of termination, and so on. So we wanted to move on into the cover crop species and mixes, because that's a perennial question we get with cover crops. What are farmers using? And I should mention, I work with the SARE program based at University of Missouri, and we've put out information on a lot of different cover crops over the years. We know there's over 40 different species of cover crops being sold today in the US. And this is reflected in what we see farmers using, lots of different cover crops. But clearly the one that stands out, no surprise probably to anyone, is cereal rye, sometimes called the queen of cover crops, used almost 3 times as much as any other individual species. We see radish there in second place, but closely followed by winter wheat, crimson clover, and lots of other options. So clearly farmers have a wide range of species they're interested in, but in many cases, they're not planting these as the sole cover crop in the field. They're doing them as part of mixes. So we had several questions asking about mixes. First of all, were they using mixes? And we found that about 2/3 were planting mixes in 2022. An additional a couple percent had done them, but maybe we're going to not do it in 23. And then some had not done them at all. Lots of different approaches in terms of number of mixes. Some were doing just 2 species together, some 3, and obviously there were quite a few farmers doing 4 or more species in a mix. And a general pattern we've seen over the years with the survey is that the longer farmers use cover crops, the more they shift to mixes, and the more complex their mixes tend to get. That's not true of every farmer, but it's a general trend that we see. When we look at the species used in the mix, it's a pretty similar pattern in terms of what's most popular to earlier. There's just not the predominance of the cereal rye, even though it is used about half of the time in mixes, but we see radishes being very common mixes at just under a half the time. and then a number of other things being popular. Oats, crimson clover being the most popular legume, but we see that more in the southern corn belt than the northern area where it's not as adapted. But many different species obviously being used in mixes. In terms of how things have changed over time, like I was just alluding to, we see the green fraction, 45%, the number of their species has increased, so not quite half the farmers. A similar number, they've kept that number of species the same. And then there's a small percentage that's decreased, that maybe they started out with mixes and just weren't satisfied with that, found it a little messy, so they went back to maybe just doing a single species. Yield impact is something that's always of great interest with cover crops. We could probably have a whole webinar just on this topic. There's been a wide range of reports on cover crops. I really value myself what farmers share with their experience, because they are really focused on optimizing their yields. Sometimes in short-term trials, maybe the focus is on something else, like a water quality study, or there's just not time to really get the system figured out if somebody's just doing a yield study for a couple of years. But in this case, looking at farmers with a range of experiences, our whole population of farmers, you see a pattern where it's gradually increasing over time, but lots of diversity, some that are getting significant yield benefits, some that are getting losses. But again, that trend towards an improvement over time. And one thing we did was pulled out the farms that had 10 or more years of experience, since we had a lot of those farmers this year. And we found that those farmers in fields that had cover crops versus fields that didn't, keep in mind, most farmers have some fields of both situations. There's that's a fairly common situation to have fields with both cover crops and none. That those that were able to provide that data, it was about a 6.3% yield gain on soybeans and a very similar number on corn for those with 10 years or more experience. So they've really become comfortable with using cover crops, know how to optimize their management. On the flip side, the farmers that were pretty new to cover crops with 2 years or less of cover crop experience still had modest yield gains with soybeans. This is similar to what we've seen in past surveys, about just over 3%. And the corn yields were not statistically different. There were some fields with corn that had higher yields, some with lower yields. We know if you use corn after cereal rye and don't adjust your nitrogen management, occasionally people run into some yield losses. But overall, the corn yields were the same for those that were relatively new to cover cropping, but much better if you had several years of experience. Moving on to planting approaches, perhaps not a surprise that most cover crops are planted by the farmer themselves. We do see some still using aerial applications, some that are paying a neighbor to do it, some that are hiring an ag retailer. I'd stress that this is their most common approach. If you asked a lot of farmers that are doing lots of acres of cover crops, they'll usually use a mix of approaches. They may drill a lot of them, but fly on some early. It just kind of depends on that farmer's individual situation. The specific seeding methods, we found that drilling is the most common at 44%, but a lot of people are broadcasting, maybe using a fertilizer spreader or some other type of device. Some are having them broadcast by airplane, that was 12%. A few are using a precision row crop planter. Sometimes they'll do that to get over more ground. A lot of farmers have really large row crop planters. If they've been set up on 15-inch centers, that can work reasonably well for cover crops. And then there's a few that are doing other approaches. The timing of planting, as we've seen in past years, the majority are planting after cash crop harvest. Now, these numbers don't add up to 100% because farmers are using more than one approach in timing. We had about a third that are doing at least some of their cover crops broadcast before cash crop harvest. So that number is ticking up from what we might have seen 8 or 10 years ago. We especially are seeing more that are interseeding early in the year. If we went back a decade ago, there would have been hardly any farmers doing that. And to have what in this case would have been over 100 farmers in the survey doing that, quite a change from what we saw in the past. Also, some that are seeding so early as to be doing a frost type of seeding. So a wide variety of timing approaches, but clearly the majority doing it after harvest in a lot of cases. Termination methods, kind of jumping ahead if we're having an overwintering cover crop and terminating in the spring. Herbicides continues to be the most common way farmers are usually doing that, with 55 having that as their usual control method. Now, quite a few farmers still use cover crops that winter kill. Those might be oats or radishes that are going to die in late fall by the winter conditions. When we get into the horticulture users is where we're going to start to see some mowing or tillage. It would be somewhat rare for a grain farmer to use mowing, for example, to kill their cover crop. We do also see some use of roller crimper. Now, that could be both horticulture users and some organic grain farmers will use roller crimper, and even some non-organic grain farmers. So that is still a modest practice in terms of percentage of use, but getting a little more popular. And then tarping, if you're wondering about that, that's kind of showing up on some small acreage vegetable farms as a way to kill the cover crop without having to till the soil or do other disturbance, or as an alternative to perhaps mowing the cover crop. So planting green, if you're not real familiar with that, this is the idea, as Ryan referred to earlier, of going out and planting our cash crop when the cover crop is still alive and green. Maybe it's been terminated that same day. Sometimes it's terminated after planting the cash crop. So that could happen when that cover crop is still pretty small, like 4 to 6 inches tall in the upper left photo, or when that cover crop is getting pretty big, like 4 to 6 feet tall in the lower right photo. And again, a decade ago, this would have been rare that people would have been doing that, but now it's becoming a much more common practice. In fact, we saw for 2022 that 58% of the soybeans were being planted green. That's a pretty remarkable figure. A little less common with corn for a variety of reasons. And then with some of our other crops, because we didn't have a lot of users of cotton and sorghum in the survey, those numbers were low, similarly for wheat. Planting green in terms of the percentage of their total acres, there were some that were doing that on nearly all their cover crop acres, but for many it was a practice they were just using occasionally. So it just varied from farm to farm. In terms of how that planting green influenced the management, how was it making management more challenging? You know, at first glance, it would seem like, gosh, you're going out and planting into that green living cover crop. That seems tough to do, right? Well, quite a few said that they found management was actually similar or simpler, and then a similar number that it was about the same management. There were some that found it more difficult, but they felt the benefits outweighed the difficulty, and a relatively small fraction were not so sure they wanted to continue due to some management challenge, but pretty favorable overall. That's also reflected in what they experienced in terms of potential challenges. So weed control actually consistently improved for most farmers doing planting green. That's maybe not a surprise. You're letting the cover crop grow longer, so it's suppressing more, has more chance to suppress the weeds farther into the season. Sometimes farmers worry that haven't tried planting green, that it's going to cause problems with diseases or nitrogen tie-up, slugs, voles, and it can, depending on this particular field or the management approach. But the majority of farmers, those with the orange, are saying they're not seeing a big difference for those factors. And then there were a few for those that found it was actually better when planting green, that they had less problems with slugs or less problems with voles. So it varied. Certainly there could be problems with slugs and voles in those situations or nitrogen tie-up, but overall a pretty positive picture. Now, I will quickly say, as a cover crop advisor myself, I'm always cautious about telling brand new farmers to plant green. It's a little safer to terminate earlier, use a winter kill cover crop, but as they get experience, we're seeing many farmers find some benefits from trying this approach. And one of those big benefits is helping with moisture management. 2/3 said it was helping them with their moisture management. Now, this was for 2022. In 23, many of our areas of the Corn Belt had relatively dry springs. And where I'm at in Missouri, it was a very dry spring. And so if we had people planting green this year, they may have run short on moisture to get that cash crop growing. This was a good year to terminate that cover crop early if you were in one of those regions with dry spring conditions. But overall, climatologists are telling us that many of our production areas are getting wetter springs on average. Again, not every year, but more consistently wetter springs. And so this can be a management tool to help in those wet springs in terms of transpiring some soil moisture, getting that field in condition to plant. What about cover crop incentives? There's been lots of discussion as of late about cover crop incentives, whether it's climate smart programs, boost in money for NRCS, or even the private sector. We found in terms of farmers that had reported on their experience with cover crop payments, that 72% of those that did not get a payment in 2022 had never received a payment. And I want to stress, this is not all the farmers in the survey. This is those that did not take a payment in 2000, or I'm sure he did take a payment in 2022 or didn't. So they had reported on that. So quite a few had never received a payment. You can see that EQIP was the most popular of the remaining payments. And then in terms of the type of payment that they did receive in 2022, looking just at those that received payments, we saw, again, quite a few different approaches that were received here, including some with private company payments is getting more common. A lot of farmers were in that pandemic program to get a crop insurance rebate, or they might have been in Iowa, Illinois, or some other states that were offering state-level crop insurance rebates. The number of years of incentive payments, it varies. EQIP contracts are normally 3 years for cover crop. CSP payments are typically 5 years for cover crop payments. Some state programs are 1 or 2 years, so it just varies. Lots of variation among the private sector programs too. But you can see one thing I would stress is this is the total years that the farmer has received some incentive payments. So not necessarily on a given field. They may have signed up one field for a 3-year EQIP contract. Then as that expired, signed up some other fields. But certainly some farmers that have had incentives for a number of years. Now, this is the big question I hear a lot is, once that incentive payment goes away, does the farmer stick with cover crops? And this is really a strong answer on that. That 67% said definitely yes, they're going to stick with cover crops after those payments end. Another 22, almost 23% probably yes. So we're looking at about 90% are saying they're either definitely or probably going to stick with cover crops after those incentive payment ends. So I think that's one of the key findings in the survey. We never asked that question before, and it is a common one that comes up in policy circles. And on the flip side, we only had about 3% that said they would stop using cover crops, either probably or definitely, after the incentive ends. So 90% saying it's either definitely or probably continuing, only 3% saying they are definitely going to stop the cover crops or probably discontinue. Okay, with that, we'll wrap up. There was lots more data in the survey and in the report. We didn't have time to cover it all. We wanted to just hit some highlights for you and wanted to leave plenty of time for some questions. So Ryan and Andy and I will be happy to respond to any questions you have.
That's great. Thanks a lot, Rob and Ryan and Andy for the presentation. And now, as Rob mentioned, Dr. Myers mentioned, we've got some time for questions. There's a Q&A down at the bottom of your screen. So we encourage you to ask questions. Of course, I say that, and I punched the wrong button when PJ asked about recordings being available. So I will try to be more competent. In the meantime, the question that the PJ asked was, will there be a recording? Yes, there will. We'll make it available. And if you need a transcript for quotes and that kind of thing, please just let us know. Callie's email is on the Zoom invitation and also on the press release you received about an hour and a half ago. And we'll be happy to get you what you need. Okay, I've got a question from Pam Smith. What was the most surprising thing you learned from the survey? So we'll do this, we'll just do this in an organized manner. We'll ask in the order of presentations. So Andy, what was the thing that most surprised you about the survey?
Well, I think we're probably going to come up with pretty similar answers here, Steve, as far as that myth about owned land versus rented or leased land. I'll let Rob and Ryan comment on that a little bit more, but the other part of it too, I think, is just that continual longer term support of cover crops. You know, you're seeing the more experience they have with it, the more comfort they have with their land and their practices and their plan for their farm, the more they're looking to adopt these and continue to tweak them and working with their advisors as well as their seed companies. So really like to see that long-term trend.
Awesome. Ryan, what about you?
Well, I would agree with Andy in terms of the land ownership. So I'll put my sticker, my vote towards what Rob just covered in terms of the future intentions beyond the cover crop incentives. I think that's another great commitment that the results speak for themselves. What they've seen, what they've learned, the benefits to the soil health, the crop condition. Ultimately, we do know, of course, yield matters, and so cover crops and future intentions with or without incentives to me is an important validation.
Awesome. Rob, what about you?
Well, like Andy, I thought the land component was interesting. The one, just to mention something different, the one that kind of stuck out to me was kind of a small point that Ryan quickly covered, but in the grazing of cover crops, we really had no idea whether most farmers doing that were just using their own livestock. And even though, not surprisingly, that was the majority of cases, there was a fair fraction that was using their neighbor's livestock to graze their cover crops. So I think that is something we could see a lot more of in the future, because there are many people in that situation where their neighbor has livestock and they've got the cover crops. And we haven't had a good dynamic where, you know, it's well established, what do you charge to graze your cover crops in that situation? So I suspect that's something we're going to see growing as we go forward, but it was interesting, a little higher than I would have expected.
That's interesting, and it's interesting in a way that it almost seems to parallel what we saw with manure management years ago, where it used to be a waste product, then all of a sudden we started to realize how much value there actually was, and you start thinking, what is it actually worth in monetary terms? So it's interesting to contemplate that cover crops may undergo a similar reevaluation. I'm going to read, there's a three-parter. It's like a Burma Shave ad campaign from Matthew K. So what are the policy implications of your findings of continuous cover cropping with or without payments, and how does that relate to the Farm Bill? I'm going to put that to Rob, because you covered the incentives in your talk.
Yeah, I'd be interested in Andy's perspective and Ryan's too, but well, I think that finding that 90% are either definitely or probably going to continue cover crops after the incentive payment ends really explodes the myth that farmers only do cover crops when they're paid to do them, and once the payment goes away, that's the end of it. I mean, it just, when 90% are saying they're going to continue and only 3% are saying they're going to stop, that's a pretty strong indication that the incentive is not an issue. Now, on the flip side, we didn't bring it out a whole lot in our remarks today, but we did have information in the survey about what non-users thought, and incentive payments continue to be something they're very interested in. So as a motivational tool to get farmers into cover cropping, I think incentives do play a really important role, and they help cover that transition period of the first 2 or 3 years where most farmers, let's face it, are going to have a slight reduction in their net profit because of the cost of that cover crop seed. After about 3 years, both from our survey and other data, we've seen that you start to break even and even gain some net profit as yields gradually increase and the soil improves, and maybe you have a little bit of reduction in fertilizers or other net costs. So those incentives are an important transition tool, but we don't need to have them forever. I guess that would be, as far as an individual field, you know, they can help a farmer transition a field into it. And just keep in mind, no farmer puts, if they're a 1,000-acre farmer, they don't put the whole 1,000 acres into cover crops in 1 year. They may start with a 40-acre field. The next year they add another 40-acre field, and over that 10 years that they're gradually going to experience, they may get up to half their acres or 2/3 of their acres, or even all their acres. But so we do need these incentives to help with that transition. But Andy, you work on the federal policy side. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think there's a strong interest in, continuing to increase the incentives, no matter how they're proposed, whether it's a cash payment, whether it's a reduction in crop insurance or others. I think everyone's looking at what best fits in farm policy, what will best fit in this farm bill over the next 5 years to be able to increase that adoption. And then, what does that look like as users begin to wean off of those incentives for the acres over that time? But whenever we've talked to farmers that have been involved in it for mainly 5 years or more, they're pretty much acolytes for using a cover crop, especially on those more vulnerable areas and those more vulnerable parts of their operation that need either that retention or they need that organic matter buildup and everything. And so I think the support's going to continue to be there. I think it's going to continue to be there at the federal level, the state level, and from the private sector. I mean, it's almost every day we see a major corporation coming out working with an environmental group, a grower group, and others to incentivize farmers to, continue to adopt these types of practices for environmental sustainability, but using cover crops is one of those key tools.
There was also in the report, there's a question about folks getting involved with the carbon programs, and although the uptake so far has been quite small, I imagine that will be something we'll all be watching for a while. So I encourage folks to take a look at the report and dig into some of the data that Rob and Andy have talked about. We have I'm going to ask PJ Hofstadter's questions one at a time, so we make sure we catch them both. Did the survey discuss or offer any feedback on seed supplies or shortages for cover crops? So Andy, I'm going to hand that to you because I know that is of great interest to your audience.
Thanks, Steve, and I appreciate that question, PJ. We did reference this in one of the questions, and I think Ryan reported on it. There's less than 10%, I believe it was around 7%, Ryan, if I'm right, farmers who had a challenge finding the seed that they wanted, or a shortage of seed. We think that there will always be plenty of seed out there. We have to make sure that we have plenty of understanding of what the intentions are and what the farmers plan to do from season to season. It's like any other seed. You can't just start to produce cover crop seed when the demand comes in. You've got to estimate what it's going to be like a year or 2 years out or more to be able to find the farmers to grow that seed, multiply that seed, and then have it prepared for the farmers when they ask for it or order it. So I thought the numbers were pretty encouraging because there have been some people out there saying we don't have enough seed, there's problems and everything else. When it's 7%, I think that's a pretty good number. And I think we're really trying to meet that demand. And I would probably say, and I don't think it came out in the report, Ryan, but I would probably say that 7%, some of that is driven by programs that have come out in the last 2 years that are really incentivizing the use of cover crops. So you're seeing a quick uptake of participating in programs as quickly as possible.
Well said, Andy. Nothing more to add to that other than the majority did note that they had not encountered any problems whatsoever in obtaining seed.
It's also interesting to look at the report. There's some discussion about the channels through which farmers currently get their seed and where they anticipate getting cover crop seed in the future. And so there was, I think, some interesting conversation around that, or at least answers around that, that I think might be worth looking at in the report. I'm going to ask PJ's second question regarding grazing. So is there any information from the survey talking about farmers reinstalling fence lines to allow for such grazing? And so Ryan, you covered the grazing. I don't know that that we asked specifically about fences per se or the mechanics of it, but did you pick up anything that gave you greater insight into the grazing side?
Not directly from the survey itself. That would certainly be an excellent follow-up question in future surveys. I know just from visiting with other farmers directly that that is a barrier in some parts of the country. It's more routine or accepted to utilize a simple hot wire as a perimeter fence. And of course, we all know that in so much of the Corn Belt that land ownership patterns have changed, farm sizes have gotten larger, and so there isn't that hard infrastructure to contain them, or perhaps even the associated loading facilities. So that is a barrier. To my knowledge, not very many cost share programs address that, but perhaps to again achieve that kind of sixth principle within the soil health realm, as we clearly have seen that the incentives work to keep folks applying cover crops. Perhaps it could shift to other barriers such as fencing, such as water supplies, to further complement that existing investment.
Steve, I might interject there. I think Ryan made some good points. A new technology we're seeing just coming onto the market is these collars that are being billed as fenceless technology. So the cattle or sheep or goats are wearing a collar that can give them a signal. In some products, it's an auditory signal that gives them a clue. They're at the edge of where they should be grazing. If they go too far, they can eventually get a shock. But the idea is that you don't need that fence infrastructure. You can have these collars provide the containment instead. And I think for cover crop grazing in particular, this is going to be a really important technology. Now, if we have a busy road, probably you're still going to want to have some type of physical fence to be a safeguard. But if it's on a back part of the farm away from any busy roads, then that may be all you need is that collar. You still have to deal with water, making sure the animals have access to water, but it's a interesting new technology that's just starting to show up in the U.S. marketplace this summer and fall that I think is going to play a big role with cover crop grazing.
That's a great point. I'm gonna come back to grazing if we have time, but in the meantime, we have one from Matthew K. If there's less of a reason to continue payments after 3 years or so, can there be badly needed savings from conservation spending that could be used in other farm bill support programs, for instance, updated reference prices?
Well, I'll take a first stab at that. So right now, we probably have roughly 22 million acres of cover crops in the U.S. We don't know the exact figure. Our cropland base, depending on what you include, you could say that number is 270 million acres. You could say it's 300 million acres, depending on whether you're including CRP ground, things like that. So I think the thing we would say is there are a lot of acres, and of that 20 million acres of cover crops, less than half of it has been, incentivized. So there is a long ways to go, even to get like the 50 million acres of cover crops, which would be, less than 20% of the land. So the fact that we're going to see growing investments in a number of areas of conservation, not just cover crops, I think is a good thing. And I appreciate the asker's intention that, yeah, there are other needs for farm payments, but the fact that a given field may only need 3 years of payments, there are a lot of additional fields that we want to help farmers carry that cost of transitioning, because the farmer does have a bit of a hit on their net profit for 2 or 3 years until things even out with yields and maybe some savings on fertilizers and so on. So I think we need to continue to look at making those investments in conservation, as well as, of course, other areas of ag. But I don't know if Ryan or Andy want to add to that. But
well, I think when we look at this issue, Matt, it's really one where you've got your commodity programs, your Title I, you've got your conservation, you've got your research. Each part of the Farm Bill has its component of support, funding, drivers, those kind of things, and there are a lot of areas within the Farm Bill that need additional resources. Well, we understand that we're going to have limited resources, but conservation, sustainability, those programs are always going to be a strong part of the Farm Bill. And I don't think a reallocation of resources from that to something else is a strong way to go. I think we need to continue to support the evolution of these programs and see that adoption. As Rob said, we're probably at 20 to 25 or 25 million to 30 million acres, maybe, of cover crops. We look at least 200 million acres of corn and beans in the Midwest, and then you start throwing in cotton and wheat and everything else. Those are important acres to get conservation programs and sustainability programs on. Cover crops is one of those, and those incentives are important to get that adoption and continue to get the program results that we're looking for out of things like cover crops. So yeah, I think it's going to continue to be a discussion, but I don't think it's an either or in this case.
And speaking of programs and beyond the immediate incentives in the Farm Bill or through state monies, Ryan, what other programs could journalists be looking at that are incentivizing cover crops within sort of the climate smart agriculture emphasis that we're starting to see hitting the ground?
Yeah, great question, Steve. I think the full breadth of potential new programs rolling out as a result of the historic $3.1 billion from USDA for climate smart commodity grants and partnerships. This mid to late summer is kind of the launching point with a whole lot of work that's been done the last couple of years. I know Missouri has one. I'll maybe defer to Rob to speak more to that. That was one of the first ones to come out here just recently in terms of accepting open applications. I believe in the next week or so, one additional program, and for full disclosure, both I know Rob and CTIC are both involved, called the Farmers for Soil Health, and that's a 20-state region with a goal of 1.3 million acres over the next few years. And that basically runs from North Dakota to Kansas, more or less to the East Coast. So CTIC is actually going to be helping provide the farmer-facing technical assistance in South Dakota, in Minnesota, and Wisconsin. There's other state-based partnerships that have all rallied support to provide great farmer technical assistance and help get them started or get them the resources they need to expand adoption of cover crops. So stay tuned here just in the next week for more information about Farmers for Soil Health, which is led by the National Pork Board, National Corn Growers Association, and United Soybean Board. But Rob, do you want to comment about the Missouri program?
Yeah, I mean, there are quite a few of these climate smart projects that have cover crops as a program they're providing farmer incentive payments for. We have one through the University of Missouri that's called the Missouri Circle Project. And that one, like Ryan mentioned, similar to Farmers for Soil Health, is providing some farmer incentives. We're doing a couple of unique things with ours. We have cover crop grazing as something we're incentivizing. We're also encouraging farmers to try a little later termination of the cover crop where appropriate, watching the weather. If it's a dry spring, still terminate early. But so I think we're going to see more of these climate smart programs having an impact. And then, of course, the private sector. I think, Steve, you were probably asking about that a bit too. Andy mentioned this earlier. Lots of private companies stepping into this space, encouraging farmers to grow cover crops, either with soil carbon payments specifically, or more generally regenerative agriculture payments.